Hey students, welcome back. I'm in a change of scenery. Couldn't get all the questions done in that last 15-minute video, so just be mindful there'll be a few kids walking by. So if we look now at question 4, okay. So text engage an audience by telling stories of struggle. Discuss with reference to at least one text you have studied. So here's our instructional, which is discuss in yellow. Let's have a look down below. When it's asking us to discuss, here we go. I'll Control C, Control V. Put it here. And provide by telling stories of struggle. So that will be our red highlighted section. Doing with reference to at least one text, I think this would be a great question to look at multiple struggles within a text, within multiple texts. So I'm thinking the net as well as BlackRock here. So if we think of the red section here, text engage an audience. So think about engage, okay, through construction, which is the how. And then more importantly, this section, stories of struggle. So many of you have answered this question already with your practice ones last Friday, but just think about whose story of struggle. So whose, if I can get the spelling right, whose struggle. Now you've got to really, I suppose, address that point and talk about the audience as well. So your audience, why is it engaging? Perhaps because it's different for the audience in terms of their pre-existing ideas. Yeah, pre-existing ideas, beliefs, and values and attitudes. Okay, and then the stories of struggle. If we think BlackRock, we're probably thinking the struggle for the women and the women as a marginalized group within society, but also looking at the males within society. What's their struggle? What's Jared's struggle? Thinking about Jared's struggle is perhaps what the author wants us to consider. Trace is dead. Sherry, Diane have no agency. But what about Jared? And what comment is the author making about Jared? And boys like Jared who are trying to deal with their emotions, but yet are not allowed because of the toxic masculine environment in which we're living. If you're thinking of Nanette, I think the struggle is somewhat obvious, and that's the struggle, again, of the marginalised, the silenced, the voiceless. But it's also the struggle of the lesbian comic, the mental health sufferer, for example, the abuse victim, the abuse survivor. So many different stories. Is it engaging? Well, it could be engaging because it evokes a sense of sympathy from an audience, but also that obvious empathy concept that we've been looking at these last few questions. So great question, quite a lot to do. So you've got to make sure you're outlining points that for and against. So you have to essentially say, well, are these texts engaging? Thinking of your own context as well here. How have you responded to the text based on your own personal beliefs, values, and attitudes, and your ideology? Great question. Would love to see more people choosing a question like this. Very broad, but allows for some really in-depth responses. If we now look at question 5, how does a text you have studied work to promote specific perspectives? Okay, we've got the how. We know that how is the instructional term. Looking at construction, remember that. How is always the construction of a text. So how is the text constructed, essentially? You've studied to promote specific perspectives. And then perspectives is a syllabus term. Now, you should have the handouts. Knowing that perspective is created by a number of factors, most importantly the context, okay? So one's context would define one's perspective. So if we're thinking of Hannah Gadsby, we know that she's the perspective of a marginalized voice, but also a lesbian, a comic, an actor, a celebrity, a mental health sufferer, a victim of sexual assault, those sort of aspects. But then what is she trying to suggest, and what is she saying in her body of work, and how does she say it? Okay, so you could talk about the construction in terms of the manipulation of the genre here, and how this text works cleverly to subvert the genre, in that it opens with what would be a typical stand-up comedy routine, but then works to build that release, gradual tension and release. And she really emphasizes that aspect, that she's leaving us with the release. Why is she doing that? She's trying to promote that perspective that this is something we as Australians, and Australians as a whole, not necessarily white Australian males, but we need to, I suppose, come to terms of what we have in Australia currently isn't enough in terms of recognising difference and recognising the other, the marginalised, etc. So I think she does that cleverly in that tension, that that building up of tension and subsequent release, tension, release, but then obviously leaving us with that tension, because that is for us to pull our socks up and for us to manipulate, and not to manipulate, but for us to guide oneself out of this. So tricky question, but just thinking about the perspectives provided from Hannah Gadsby in achieving her message of change and the need for change in Australian society. Question 6. Socks. Fiction texts can often make as serious and effective social commentary as non-fiction text. Classic kind of statement text. Okay, so here's the statement, put it in red. And then we've got the instructional term for this one is evaluate. Okay, so we're evaluating, just get rid of that. Evaluating, we're